Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Zhongfeng Tian. I'm honored to serve as chair of the Bilingual Education Research Special Interest Group. On behalf of the BERSIG, I warmly welcome you to this special webinar celebrating the launch of this edited volume, Autoethnographic Explorations of Lived Racial Linguistic Experiences Among Multilingual Scholars Looking Inward to Move Forward. For those who are new to our community, the BERSIG is a dynamic and growing space within AERA. We support and advance research, teaching, and community engagement focused on bilingual education and multilingualism. Our SIG is dedicated to building community and fostering dialogue around bilingual teacher preparation, instructional practices, language policy, and educational equity. I want to begin by thanking our webinar working group, Kristen Pratt, along with Alicia Wayne, Ji Ma, and Nirmala Flores, for your thoughtful planning and care in organizing today's event. This powerful volume, co-edited by my longtime colleagues and dear friends, Dr. Qianqian Zhang-Wu and Dr. Bridget Goodman, makes a timely and critical contribution to the field of language education. I've had the pleasure of working with both Qianqian and Bridget over the years on publications, panels, and countless conversations that have enriched my own scholarly journey. They are not only brilliant researchers, but also generous collaborators and deeply thoughtful friends, grounded in a shared commitment to multilingual justice. While much research has looked back at the colonial history of English or forward toward decolonial possibilities, this book takes a bold step inward. Through autoethnography, it creates a healing space for multilingual scholars to share their lived racial-linguistic experiences. What makes this volume so compelling is how it builds a community of practice, where contributors shaped by diverse culture and linguistic backgrounds come together to reflect, resist, and reimagine. This is a book that speaks not only to scholars, but to anyone committed to equity and in education. Qianqian and Bridget, congratulations on this deeply meaningful and beautifully curated work. It's a joy and privilege to celebrate with you today. And with that, I will turn it over to the stars of today's event.
Thank you so much, Zhongfeng. This is such with Bridget and I feel like tears are coming out. This is so touching. Thank you so much for the warm introduction for our edited collection. And we are super, super grateful for Zhongfeng as well as all your team in AERA Bilingual Education SIG for sponsoring this event. We are also extremely grateful for Multilingual Matters, which is the publisher for our book. Both Bridget and I, and Zhongfeng actually, we all have multiple books that's coming out or have already came out with Multilingual Matters in addition to this one. So we are really, really grateful to be working with such a wonderful publisher and all the colleagues that's here in this room with us. So thank you, everyone. So my name is Qianqian Zhang-Wu, and together with my really lovely colleague, Bridget Goodman, we have co-edited this collection of scholarship, which looks inward at the lived racial-linguistic experiences of multilingual scholars through autoethnography. So in this book launch event and author talk, we will start by talking a little bit about why we started this journey. Just now, Zhongfeng has mentioned a very, very scholarly way. There are research that's look backward, there's research that's look forward, but we are looking inward. But then we're going to present the more human story of how we started to look inward and why we believe it's so important to look inward. And then we will discuss some common themes and threads of the book before transitioning to a panel of 4 authors in the book. As you can see, they're wonderful scholars from all over the world at different career stages in their scholarship. So we will learn from their story, learn from their engagement with autoethnography, as well as racial linguistics as a theory. So before anything, let's talk about how we started this journey. So what you see here is an ancient picture. It's an antique of Bridget and I when we were young and naive, and that's different from how we look now, but that's okay. That's 12 years ago. So you will know we have known each other for quite a while. So this picture was taken during Bridget's graduation ceremony from the University of Pennsylvania, and I was a graduate student there. So that's us back then. And so now 12 years after this picture has taken, we both of us have worked in different institutions as scholars and teachers working to support multilingual students. And many of our studies and scholarship aim to advocate for linguistic justice for our students. But what I try to say is that approximately 10 years after this picture was taken in 2022, I became the proud mother of a kindergarten age child. So in the school application process, we were asked by the school district to put in some information about our child's language proficiency. Because my husband does not quite speak English, quite speak Mandarin Chinese, so we usually use English at home. Therefore, this is what I put in the school application form for my daughter's kindergarten application. So I wrote, even though my child primarily speaks English at home and feels the most comfortable communicating in English, she is able to communicate in Mandarin to connect with her grandparents. So I never gave much thinking into it and just submitted the school application. What happens is that a couple weeks later, I received an email from the school. The email says, your child so and so has exposure to a language other than English. Because of this, we will need to assess your child's English language proficiency. When I opened this email, I felt deeply offended and angry for two reasons, right? The first one is how a lot of literature has talked about how Asian Americans are positioned as forever foreigners, right? The fact you know you're multilingual doesn't necessarily stop people from thinking you are a forever foreigner and you are linguistically incompetent. But what is even more offensive here is the usage of the word exposure. 2022, we're still in the pandemic, and using the word exposure to describe my child's connection to her home language and culture is as if indicating that knowing a language other than English is as negative, as problematic as being contracted with COVID. So I was really, really upset, and I had a conversation with Bridget about it. As Bridget was trying to calm me down, we looked into the literature. We recognize that in the field, there are so many, many wonderful studies that look outward at how we can support our students, how we can advocate for their linguistic justice. But there is a lack of research that looks inward at the lived racial-linguistic experiences among multilingual scholars. And this is how we started this journey.
So thank you, Qianqian. And so I'll just continue by saying that as Qianqian told that story then and as now, I still feel outraged by how she was treated. And I feel it was the shared outrage that led Qianqian to say, we need to write a book about this. We need to co-edit a book. We need to do this together. And, to pardon the pandemic metaphor, Qianqian's energy is infectious in a good way. And so it's been a wonderful collaboration. I just briefly want to say three things about the book, and particularly about autoethnography and raciolinguistic perspectives for those of you on the Zoom who might not be familiar with these approaches or concepts. First, again, I want to say that the authors, and we have 15 authors in our chapter, in our book, including Qianqian and I, each writing our own narratives. We have one duo ethnography, so 15 scholars altogether, and they represent diversity in academia in a number of ways. We have PhD students, we have full professors, we have people at different stages of their career in between. Interestingly and sadly, there were one or two early career professors who refused to participate because they were afraid of how writing these stories would impact their career. So we have to give the authors in our volume credit for being willing to go on paper and to document some of their experiences, sometimes with their own colleagues. But also, more importantly, when we talk about diversity, you may immediately think simply of racial diversity, of color, but our authors represent diversity in a number of ways, in terms of being transnational, in terms of being multinational, in terms of they talk about intranational diversity, in terms of different indigenous backgrounds, and in terms of intersecting with a number of other identities that get highlighted in this volume. And that get overlooked by others that they interact with as they document, as they write about in this volume. Key was we asked all of the authors in some way to adopt an autoethnographic approach, which means not just writing autobiographies, but systematic reflection on their lived experiences. So in my own case, I had to write narratives and then interpret the narratives as if they were data from outside of myself. And as Adam says, autoethnography is about looking inward into our identities, thoughts, feelings, and experiences, and outward into our relationships, communities, and cultures. So everyone in the volume is doing this inward reflection to consider how we as individual scholars then interact with the outside world and how the outside world interacts with us, and to offer critical commentary on those experiences. We also asked authors to ensure that in some way they incorporate a raciolinguistic perspective to interpret their experiences, which in brief means that recognizing that language is viewed and critiqued at the nexus of race and power, particularly through the gaze of the white listening subject, who is not necessarily white. But it means, in short, that people may observe a speaker and critique that speaker's language, but in a way that is done because the listener connects that speaker's language to a particular racialized identity, and often in a deficit way. But it's also important to note that our scholars in the volume were free and able to draw on complementary theories as well to understand raciolinguistic ideologies and practices. So I look at positioning theory. We have an author who looks at endarkened feminist pedagogies, and the authors who are presenting today may also talk about some of the complementary theories that they combined with raciolinguistic perspectives, which shows how broad, in terms of context and in terms of theory, how complementary raciolinguistic perspectives are. Okay, next slide, Qianqian, please. Okay, so again, all of that leads us to the book today, and again, you'll be hearing from 4 of the authors from that volume. They'll have about 10 to 12 minutes to present their chapter, and that should leave us plenty of time at the end for questions. If you would like to order the book from the Multilingual Matters website, we have a discount code that you can use for that purpose. And with that, I say thank you. And Qianqian, are we ready then for the first speaker?
Yes, I'm gonna stop sharing right now. Traya, are you ready?
Yes, I'll start sharing my screen. Just give me a sign when you see my PowerPoint. Are you
We're going to present from right to left in the order on the flyer.
lovely? Are you seeing my slides? Qianqian?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. Before starting my presentation, I want to thank the editors of this book, Dr. Zhang-Wu and Dr. Goodman, for helping me tremendously in thinking through the episodes of complicated colonial and international violence of English that pervade my memories of different classrooms, not just in North America, but also in India. Through their compassion and intellectual provocations, I could emotionally distance myself from many of these traumatic memories to examine them as sites of contestation, where impositions of linguistic and bureaucratic authority were pushed back, sometimes assertively and sometimes quietly. Okay, yes. I start by revisiting the fondest memory of my great grandmother and my grandfather, who naturalized resistance as a way of being. Through their repeated refusal to fit in one box or another, they demanded to be seen as full people. The linguistic concepts that I am now familiar with were not the tools available to them. Yet, in writing this chapter, I have built connections between those handed down memories and the ongoing scholarly debates. While the book focuses on racial linguistics, I highlight this violence in different learning spaces through concepts like contact zones, languaging and translanguaging, and the state of languagelessness. When talking about racial linguistics, many scholars study undergraduate classrooms, and within those, they tend to focus on the students who are racially and culturally othered and victimized. When I started writing this chapter, it was clear that linguistic violence for me had started much before I entered the American classrooms. The cultural training that privileged colonial language over one's local language was rebranded in my primary and middle school as the link language to connect India with the world. To translate one's ambition into upward social economic mobility, English has been touted as a necessity. In my non English language teaching classrooms, also, this necessity was violently forced upon the student and teachers alike. Pushed to a state of languagelessness, our continued incompetence riled the administration into taking harsher approaches like humiliation and shaming. It is such formative memories that have shaped my relationship with English. It was a joyless, punishing language. The only reason I continued to remain drawn to it was that I was too impressed with my grandfather, who had completed his master's in English from YMCA London. I wanted to become an intellectual like him, for when he spoke, people listened. Before I started enjoying pushing back the dominance of English and its racial linguistic practices, I was in literature classrooms in India, where this type of violence often goes unacknowledged. At one of the most prestigious colleges of a high ranking university, when I failed to impress my teacher of Victorian literature, I was bluntly asked, "Where have you come from?" This question probed me. It tried to connect my deficiency in English to my social, economic, and curricular training contexts. It took me years, including the time I spent to build this chapter, to unpack the embedded assumptions about geography, caste, class, and home support in these seemingly benign questions. At this stage, I used rote learning as a way to recite back answers in the language my teachers used while teaching, but I was flunked successively for 3 years. Meanwhile, aside from broad comments like lacks analysis, we were not guided about how to improve these gaps, nor did we have any para-academic support like the writing centers. To improve the written English was one's own prerogative or an innate quality. In this classroom and others after this, I was asked to leave the English departments and go elsewhere. Reflecting on these moments, I realized that while race may not be a distinguishing factor in India, coloniality and other cultural socialities like caste lingered in the pedagogy. Such vantages predetermined our chances of success based on the books we had read, the films we watched, and the accent we spoke in. In the process of writing this chapter, I also realized that while humiliation was a common trope back home, in my North American classrooms, this violence was a bit difficult to name and comprehend. For example, many times I would get feedback where almost every sentence would be marked in red, accompanied by unclear remarks like clarity, awkward, long winded. Many times, one also encountered motivating comments which were confusing, like, "That's intriguing, but what do you mean?" While I have actively sought feedback in all my classrooms, the process of writing and thinking for this chapter revealed that this ask may not necessarily culminate into improvement. Sometimes it also causes immense mental and emotional strain, curtailing my capacity to improve, rather filling me with inertia. However, for these memories to be contentious, it is critical to acknowledge the moments of unintended solidarity and collectivizing. On the one hand, my mind took me back to the ardent protestations from my great grandmother in front of the police station. As a teacher and single mother, she demanded from the institutions, the school, and the police to see her composedly as a mother, as a teacher, and as a social worker committed to the improvement of her community. I reclaim this history to show that if language deficiency can be marked innate to me, then so is this resilience. On the other hand, I have the memory of my caste oppressed and BIPOC classmates who would commonly sit together on one side in the back. To be together meant that we could fight the fear of getting targeted. Another space in which I found terrific support were the writing centers. In my graduate classrooms in the US, I was asked to approach a multilingual expert who was hired for students like me who had great ideas, but their language could not carry the burden of their intellect. In this space, from this expert, I learned how to divide the entire writing process into smaller units to understand that writing is different types of thinking and doing, and all of those types cannot be exercised in one go with proficiency. Suddenly, it was clear to me that my entire English was not deficient. The deficiency was not in my arguments, but probably I had to organize, I had to plan, I had to allocate ample time in order to complete the assignment to its maximum potential. This advice was particularly useful when I was writing this chapter, for I had to deliberately revisit many traumatizing memories, sit with them, think through the injury and the repercussions of those injuries, and how now, as a writing teacher, I try to undo those damages. Today, I have exited English departments. I'm now pursuing a PhD in the Department of Humanities, and I work closely with the marginalized students whose first language may not be English. My encounters with these students have also enabled me to see other contexts, such as exposure to college education, the regional teaching systems, and others that can shape one's proficiency in the way English develops for them. Currently, I'm working to set up my writing center in India, a dream that began to materialize in the process of writing this piece. I want to provide the comprehensive linguistic support I crave to have in my school and undergraduate classrooms. Thank you.
Thank you, Shreya.
I just asked if I unmuted myself and I realized I did not because no one was responding. So I'm Jung Kim. I am going to present as soon as I remember how to present. So I love in the moment where you forget how to do anything. Okay. Are you guys seeing my slides or also my speaker notes?
I think we are seeing your speaker notes as well.
All right, that's what I thought. Okay, let me do this again. Sorry. I'm presenting from Google Slides and I wasn't sure with Zoom how that worked. So, all right, so I'm Jung Kim. I'm at Lewis University, which is outside Chicago in Illinois. And I'm going to talk about my book chapter, Jung Like Jungle, Reclaiming Names and Languages. And so I'll kind of have, I didn't change this part, I apologize, but I'm going to do 3 parts to this. I'm going to talk a little bit about where I'm from, the theory and methods I use to kind of look at my experiences, and then kind of the results if you're looking at empirical research. and basically how I got here. And so when I introduce myself, I usually talk about I'm a 1.5 generation Korean American. And it's interesting because I feel like outside of Korean American spaces, I don't hear a lot of people use the 1.5 gen. But I was born in Korea, but I came over when I was 4. So for the most part, I'm American. But I am, I guess, technically an immigrant. I'm also a cisgender woman, a mother, and a scholar. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of my introduction or where I came from in terms of coming to this chapter and some of my overall experiences. I was actually born in Korea. My parents had immigrated to the US, but my mom had gone back to have me because they basically couldn't afford childcare. And my halmoni, or my grandmother, her mom, raised me until I was 4. And so you can see a picture of me in Korea. And then this is when we came to Chicago. I'm the oldest of 3. My dissertation work is always surprising to people. It's looking at hip hop in the classroom, which is very, very different from where I am now. And I'll talk a little bit about my journey in terms of coming to Asian American representation, and then really what that means in terms of claiming and reclaiming Asian American identity, both through names and languages. And so I drew a lot on critical race theory and Asian crit. That informs quite a lot of my work. I was really excited when I first found Asian crit because I felt like there were so many other groups that were drawing upon aspects of critical race theory, but didn't address some of the issues that Asian and Asian American folks have to deal with. So, Chen already talked about things like the model minority and the forever foreigner. There's the whole racial wedge. So there's a lot of pieces of being Asian. And I think even with the anti-Asian attacks because of COVID, you see also the transnational implications of things that happen in Asia that happen to people in America. And then racial linguistics is also a newer theoretical framing for me. And I've had the great benefit of learning more and working with it more since I've been collaborating a little bit with Chen and her work. And I realized what I had attributed to as my kind of racialization throughout my childhood, I realized was also both my racialization in regards to my language use as well. And autoethnography is also somewhat newer. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about my name and the history because I feel like that captures a lot of both where I'm coming from and kind of how I evolved over time. So my name is Kim Jong-un, which I'll joke is, I actually have the same name as the leader of North Korea. And so when I became a school board member, I got elected to my local school board. I made a joke about like, whoever thought that someone with the same name of the leader of North Korea would become an elected official. But when I was young, when I first started school, I have a distinct memory of being in kindergarten and one of the other little girls asking me why my name wasn't Kim, because that was a normal name. And so that's something I get often, or I love when a telemarketers or I'm on customer service, people ask me my last name. And when I say Kim, they say, your last name. And I have to affirm that is my last name. And so kind of the constant notions of what is normal or not. People are always very surprised when I say my name has been constantly mispronounced since early on because it's 4 letters and it's phonetic. But I've gotten Zhang from my piano teacher, Young, June. Even when I've tried to use like the Jung, like jungle, I've had a couple people be like, your name is Jungle. Like people just cannot hear what my actual name is. And then the other interesting thing is people feel the need to comment on my name. So I can think of very few people that I've met where I feel the need to make any sort of comment about their name. But people have told me, oh, it's so beautiful, or that's different, or where does it come from? And so I don't particularly, I'll be honest, I don't particularly think my name is beautiful. I think it's fine. It's my name. But I also think it's interesting that people feel the need to provide commentary. In the chapter I read about in 6th grade, when my parents were in the middle of doing some immigration paperwork for me, I had an opportunity to change my name. And so for months, I tried out different American names and I came down to Jessica or Christina. And at the end, I decided I really didn't like either of those names. And so that was my first, I think, attempt to claim my identity. And so that is an experience I think a lot of folks don't necessarily have, where you can kind of choose particularly as a younger child, what your name wants to be and get to reaffirm that identity. With that said, I think it's always a process. So I've had so many conversations with people about what is your Starbucks name. So do you give your given name or do you make up a fake name? So I had an Indian boyfriend in college whose name was Umar, and he went by Striker as Starbucks, just to kind of mess with people. But I always give Kim, and my kids will push back on that sometimes and be like, "That's not your name." I'm like, "Well, it's my last name. It's because I don't feel like spelling it." But this assumption of that it's always going to be difficult. And so one of the things in terms of how I came to autoethnography, I will be honest, in my training at an R1 university, the curriculum folks who did a lot of autoethnography were kind of seen as like belly button gazers. And so I was taught that empirical research is king, right? And so I never thought I would actually do autoethnography. But what I found was that as I was doing more and more research and doing interviews with people, I felt the need to interject. One, that's a very expensive thing to do because you pay to transcribe your own voice and your own stories that you're familiar with. But two, I realized like my story is also part just as much as I prized the narratives of others and their stories and how they got here. I had to realize my own voice was just as important. And so I did a photo collage of kind of my journey in terms of scholarship and how I ended up where I am. So like I said, my dissertation work was looking at hip hop in the classroom, and I taught it on the west side of Chicago, and that was my attempt to kind of reconcile the differences between what I saw my students being able to do in the classroom and what I saw them not being able to do or not being recognized in the classroom. And I will say, as an Asian American woman from the Midwest, I didn't feel particularly authentic in representing myself as doing hip hop research. And it's not to say that I'm not, but I felt like that was a space that would just be more resistant to me. And so I had a conversation with someone in graduate school, one of my professors, about how I'd always been really interested about my racialization as an Asian American person in an all Black school, how the kids didn't know what to make sense of me. And so they actually said, like, that's a great idea. I wasn't able to come back to it for many years, I think because I didn't feel like I had the support or the wherewithal to do it. But a lot of my research is based on that now. I will say, along my journey, I've had some really amazing solidarity and friendships and allyships with a lot of folks from different groups. And so one of my greatest experiences was actually the Cultivating New Voices Fellowship Program, which is part of the National Council for Teachers of English. It's all for scholars of color, and that's where I got a chance to see people who were doing work within their own communities, and it was seen as valid. In that time, I have a writing group where we're all women of color. A couple of us are immigrants. I ran for school board with my friend Cherie, and we did it specifically kind of as an interracial platform. A lot of my running friends, so this is us at the London Marathon, are also multiracial. And so what I realized over time is that I'm always seeking community and I'm looking for ways where I can fit in. And for a long time, I thought that someone else would create those spaces for me. But I actually realized I had to start doing that on my own. So these are a couple different pieces from the Asian American Caucus, which I started at NCTE. And then Qianqian and I are actually doing a work with Asian American women in higher education, their experiences. So it's been very much a personal journey for me. One of the other things I think I struggled a lot with is, what does it mean to be Korean or American? And I think one of the changes I made. So I had this experience in high school where another student called me a Twinkie, and I didn't know what that meant. And so I had this challenge of, was I Korean enough? I didn't speak Korean very well, although I do speak Korean to my parents. I didn't go to the Protestant church a lot of the other Koreans went to. I joke that I did all the wrong Asian things. I was in band instead of orchestra. I did debate instead of science club. I was an English major instead of math. And so I had to really wrestle with, what does it mean to be a 1.5 generation Korean American? What does it mean to not have native proficiency? What does it mean to not do kind of the stereotypical things? And so one of the things I came across was actually this just today. And this is a fabric artist, Shin Hee Chen, who had a installation, a series on mother tongue and motherhood. And I loved this because she's Korean. And on the right side, she has written in Korean what it says in English on the left-hand side, which is my mother tongue is your foreign language. Your mother tongue is my foreign language. And she wrestled a lot with both language and her own racialization as in terms of being a mother and what that meant in terms of passing on language and what it meant to not. And so one of the things I've wrestled a lot with is language. And so I came over when I was 4, and my parents only speak to me in Korean. And that is hard when your parents work pretty much all day and you don't speak a lot with them at home. And so my Korean is very stunted and not very good. I will say as I've gotten older, it's even harder. It's like a muscle memory that you kind of slowly forget. And so sometimes I'll try to speak to my parents and kind of mess things up if I think about it too hard. I talk about it in the chapter. It's kind of like you're trying to grab onto a dream. It becomes a little different. And so one of the things I've thought a lot about is what does language mean in terms of my children? And so both my children have Korean names. My daughter's Korean name is her first name, and my son's is his second name. My daughter also has wrestled with her name. And it's interesting because I've actually asked her, it's Ethel, and then I've asked her if she would ever want to change her name because she complains about it. And she actually has said no. And so I feel some affirmation that we're doing something right. Although her name means morning dew, and she tells people it means wet grass, which is not the same thing we've discussed. The other piece that I think is really interesting in terms of racial linguistics is my children were in a Spanish immersion program for K through 5. And I actually hesitated before enrolling them in that because I was like, if they don't have Korean proficiency, why should they have Spanish? I know it's not a zero-sum game, but that is something I thought about. And at one point, my son, when he was in kindergarten or first grade, said, am I Spanish, Korean, or English? Because he was learning Spanish. He knew I was Korean, and then he also spoke English. And so we had to kind of disentangle both race and language. And then my children are biracial and they feel Korean sometimes. But recently my daughter was talking to me about how she doesn't feel Korean enough sometimes because she doesn't speak the language. She's a little bit picky about the food. And when we were talking about engaging in a Korean wedding custom, she said, well, I hope I marry someone Korean because it'll be more authentic. And so this constant wrestling of what it means to be Korean and American, both with language. I mentioned in the chapter this idea of people kind of cosplaying being Korean, and Korean being just it's a kind of accoutrement. So it's K-pop, it's K-drama, it's the food, but it's never what does the actual culture mean. And the final piece I'll end with, not to wrap it up too much in a neat bow, but I had a Korean friend who talked about the name Jung, and it also has a meaning separately in Korean, which is this kind of sense of closeness or being together. And I like that a lot because I think it is a lot about all of us, kind of like what Shreya was saying about healing some of our own personal traumas, but also for me, it's also about making spaces for others. And so trying to heal some of that and create that closeness and community. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John. This is so wonderful. Now please welcome Anna.
Okay, let me just hit start here. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here today. I will talk about my chapter with the title You Sound Like From the CD. There are other ethnographic explorations of my personal and professional life in Switzerland as a multilingual scholar. This is a pretty overwhelming slide, so I'll walk you through it. So it's very colorful. On the left of the page, we have the map of Germany, and if you see the little arrow at the bottom left, that's where I grew up. That's where I'm from, and it's at the border between two different states. Between Rheinland-Pfalz and Saarland, and on the right-hand side you have a map of Switzerland with another arrow pointing at the border region again between the green and the orange part, which is Fribourg and Bern. This is where the language divide basically happens in Switzerland, dividing the country, the parts between French and German speaking, and that's where I did my PhD and my teacher training. on top of that, you have a US military cargo plane landing at the biggest Air Force base in Europe, which is very close to where I grew up. So the impact of US and American politics and language is very present where I grew up, and so I will talk about that as well. And then on the right, you have a map of Brazil. I will also talk about that, how my family has connections to Brazil, and you can see the arrow pointing to the state called Santa Catarina, and Brazil is obviously Portuguese speaking. So on this slide, you can see that, well, there are several languages that are present, that are visible, that are part of my life, which would be Portuguese, French, German, and then English to some extent, because it was we grew up hearing it a lot, being exposed to English through American military people living close by. And in Germany, it's the case that you have all these different dialects that are spoken. So where I'm from, it's not really standard German that you speak growing up. It's more of a dialect. And since I grew up really at the border of these two states, it's a mix of both dialects that I speak, which became more of an issue when I started university. Before that, people are not really exposed to standard language except for on the media, or if they travel outside of that region. But other than that, it would be considered odd if you spoke standard German. And in Switzerland, it's also similar because the official language is actually Swiss German. So it's recognized as the spoken language. It's not the written language. The written language is still standard German, but just the official spoken language in the country is Swiss German, which is different from the German that I'm familiar with, or that I speak, that I'm a speaker of. So when I moved to Switzerland, there was another exposure to something else that was unfamiliar, maybe, and which exposed me. So that exposure, going back to that word from the beginning, exposed me as something foreign, as something different. And that is what I will talk about today. All these explorations I made basically because, or thanks to this chapter that I was able to write, because otherwise I'm not sure I would have been able to really grasp and get all of this together in one coherent text, really to understand myself, to understand how I position myself, also in regards to all these languages. And I think so it's been very, very helpful for me to really understand also how that impacts my research and why I do what I do. So Bridget was mentioning that most chapters draw on this idea of raciolinguistic ideologies, and I combined my chapter with heteroglossia, Bakhtin's concept of multi-voicedness, because I thought this is really what captures well what happens inside of me, and it's multiple voices. It's not one language, really. Like, I don't see it as multiple languages existing next to each other. It's more like voices that come out at different times. And so, for instance, Portuguese is very much limited to the time in Brazil, and sometimes I feel odd speaking it. It feels like it's foreign when I speak it outside of the country, and it doesn't really flow naturally. And so maybe some of you who also speak other languages know what it's like, right? So it's really these multiple voices that come and go in a way. They do coexist and interact with each other, but sometimes they're gone and sometimes they come back. So it's a very interesting feeling, and I guess you can add to those, right? You can have more voices and add more voices and maybe lose some. And depending on the context, you're also muted. Like, the context mutes one of those voices, maybe. So, for instance, in Switzerland, it was very difficult for me to speak German, even though that's the majority language of the country. And because the voice that I had in German would out me as somebody who's not from there, and that was a very controversial issue because the country believes it's overrun by Germans, and so being exposed as a German is always very it's difficult. And I will talk about that, how that affected my dissertation when I did interviews with people in Switzerland. And Swiss German if we stay with this topic, is it's in the literature, it's considered a means of distinction from the others, the foreigners, right? And foreigners are marked out not least by their insufficient command of Swiss German, but it's more like this ideology, right? So what does Germany represent? It's not necessarily about the language, but what does it do when so many Germans are coming to Switzerland to take over jobs, for instance, from Swiss people? So this is more, and this is all in this accent, right? This is all in the language, that how that is expressed. And so I thought that given the need for more thorough research on that, because there's not so much on different languages, how they are ideologically represented. There's a lot about English and how English hegemonizing other languages, but how does German do that, right? How does German hegemonize other languages? And so that's very interesting to actually look at these different varieties in a small context, such as like three countries within Europe. Then methodology is similar between among all the chapters. So I used autoethnography, critical self-reflections. I created a list of experiences and incidents that I gathered like on a mind map. I had a handwritten mind map with descriptions and illustrations of the situations and how they all interacted with each other and how they led to my development, basically, and my more critical reflections on these incidents in form of a text or short stories. Actually, I ended up writing multiple short stories to make the incidents fit into a text format, which was not always so easy. And given the time constraints, I will just focus on two explorations here that I thought were very telling. And this is the title that I chose for this presentation, You Sound Like from the CD. So again, that was something that happened to me in Switzerland when I was teaching German as a second or foreign language. It was one of my students who said that I sounded like from the CD. And I thought it was very interesting. It never happened to me before. And then I tried to figure out why. And they told me that all the other people they interact with in Switzerland, they don't sound like that. They don't have that accent. They don't sound like from the CD. They have a Swiss German accent or a more naturally sounding accent to them. And to me, I was just speaking my own, I mean, obviously the way I speak German, right? Growing up with different dialects and also with standard German. I never thought that I would actually to me at first it was kind of like an honor, like, oh, okay, somebody thinks I have a good standard German accent, because in Germany that's not the case. Like when German people hear me speak German, they don't think I'm it's not very good, like standard like German. And so in Switzerland, all of a sudden people thought, oh, this is a great German accent. But then after feeling okay, this is like, after feeling great about this, then I realized that it's actually not great, because it means that all the other Swiss German speakers are considered less authentic. And it even happened that one of the teachers, who was a French speaker, then quit her job as a German speaker after I got hired as a German teacher, because she thought that my German was so much better than hers, that she felt so bad about teaching German as a French speaking German teacher. So it was a very rich experience, and also it was at the same time, it was good for me somehow, and bad, because I was valued for something that I had, and at the same time it devalued somebody else. So it was a very confusing experience, and I was able to reflect on this more in this book. And yeah, so You Sound Like from the CD is very controversial, I guess, and I'm not even sure now what I think about it, whether that's a good thing or not. It certainly is not a good thing to rely on these native speaker ideologies for classroom teaching, and people should be exposed to many more accents and varieties, because we're becoming more interconnected and global. So I don't think we should stick to this one variety for any language, and be more open. At the same time, we are all biased somehow, right? We all have that bias, and have our own accent. Like we develop it. It's something that happens naturally. And so I'm not sure what we can do about that. And then I told you that also these explorations or these experiences that I had influenced very much also how I conduct research as a multilingual person. And I did my dissertation in Switzerland, where I did interviews with people in the French-speaking part and the Italian-speaking part, but also in the German-speaking part. And oddly enough, it was the most difficult part to do it in German and not in French or Italian, which were kind of my second languages or foreign languages to me. It was the hardest part to do it in my own first language, in German. So one interview excerpt that I'd like to read to you is the interviewee says, "You feel foreign when you don't speak the dialect, but it doesn't bother me anymore. This has subsided. I've come to terms that you can identify me as German." So she was also a German teacher from Germany, teaching in Zurich, in the German-speaking part of Switzerland. And for me, my answer was, maybe I'll get there someday. For me, it's not that easy yet. So clearly you can see there is this negotiation going on all the time to how to relate to people, right? So when we do interviews as scholars, like we have to somehow establish like a rapport with the other person. And how do we do that? The first means is really language, right? And especially when I did my PhD, it was when I did the data collection, it was during COVID. And so I had to rely on phone interviews or Zoom. And so it really was all about audio. It was about voices, right? And so it became really obvious right away that this is your accent, this is the other person's accent. And so outing yourself right away. And the topic was about these language hierarchies and ideologies. So it was very interesting, the dynamic, how that impacted being which identity people would ascribe you, and also how you yourself position in the field as a multilingual scholar. And I'd like to conclude by saying that this process of research is therefore a process of self-identification and representation. So how we identify and how we want to identify and be identified as, and it's a representation of my voice, of my my biography and my positioning, and the responsibility that we have, and ultimately reflexivity if we get the chance. And that's the thing, we don't always have the chance to write these chapters. They're so important and meaningful, but not everybody gets to do an autoethnography about their upbringing, about their language biography, and about how raciolinguistic experiences impact who we are and who we are as scholars. And they say, for instance, that Maxi say storytelling is important, which I agree with, but I think capturing these stories through writing or documenting or other artifacts, like we just saw a photo collage, right? Like something that captures these moments, these experiences, that's very important and I think necessary as a methodology, especially in methodology classes, for instance, during a dissertation or other graduate level courses. I think would be extremely important, because there are these different directions that we have, like, right, we go back or forth, but never really have time to look inward, because it's not considered something that is a strong output, right? So it's not considered another like high impact paper or whatever. It's more about ourselves, and so I think this thinking has to change to coming to terms with who we are before we can create an output, right? Like we have to go inward first before we go out. So that's what I would like to say. Thank you so much for the opportunity again to write this.
Thank you, Anna. And now we'll turn it over to Sandro Barros.
He's here. He's coming. He's here. Yes, I am here. Let me just that's a good question. How do I do this? I don't usually. I do. No, I don't want my comments. Hang in there. There we go. Can everybody see it? Continue to share. Yes. Can everybody see this? Good. Awesome. So, hi everybody. My name is Sandro Barros, and I'm Michigan State University, or as I like to say, Michigan State University. And I thank you for Bridget's and Qianqian's invitation to present to you. I'll try to be as succinct as possible, because for quite some time I've been dealing with masses. And when we talk about especially this mess that it is to apply a racial linguistic lens to examining a particular problem or a particular phenomenon in this case, which in my case was the Portuguese language itself. So we move a little bit away from English or English interactions and sort of bracket in a sort of a phenomenological language, right? Bracket English for a second and its power and its influence to understand other phenomena, other phenomena that are related to named languages itself, like Portuguese, or it's the different ways that are practiced and their intersections with race. So dealing with that, it's very messy. And when you add autoethnography as a genre, it's very dangerous. So part of my talk here is really trying and attempting to disentangle the difficulty of writing in a genre as well, and bearing witness to this writing in this genre, bearing witness and engaging in a scholarly dialogue, I suppose, with so many things that are, mostly unknown. I mean, English is pretty dominant in the literature, right? So I'm always very happy to hear about experiences of racialization happening in other languages as well, and find this interesting. So my talk basically is going to be about the genesis of this book. And I'm going to pause here for a second, give you like a minute to see what's going on here. So my chapter was about my relationship with my adopted sister, who, gosh, is positioned as Black, but in Brazil, of course, given our complex racial identifications throughout history, passes as a morena, which is in English you would say brunette, brown, sort of, but not really brown, is brunette, which is really weird because it still has this association with whiteness. And for me, it was to write about the way that her body is being languaged and the various intersections that are operating at a discourse level in the formation of her identity, and how her positioning is not necessarily or doesn't go into neat or compartmentalized hierarchies or where you expect it to go. And for me, of course, writing as somebody that is positioned sometimes as white and sometimes positioned as Latino, or performing or being called to perform, again, these are all strategies, I think, that some people can afford more than others. And there are different levels and spaces in which these performances are allowed, they are rejected, they are accepted, they are negotiated. And the chapter tries to talk a little bit about it. Its genesis actually is very curious because I began writing it when I was researching in Cuba, Afro Palabras, which is sort of this tradition of songs that carry Yoruba language through them, and mostly performed by Afro-Cubans to broader audiences, and has this strong performative tradition of it, performing Africanness. Of course, nobody of a Yoruba that speaks Yoruba currently recognizes any of the recordings that have done as being Yoruba. But I, as a Brazilian, recognize the Yoruba from Afro-Brazilian ceremonies, which is kind of funky and interesting in its own ways. But that presence over there led me to talk about this sort of geographies and the location of the brown body below the line of the equator. And what does it mean for us, and understand this process away from the United States processes of racial linguistics, for instance, where the one-drop rule ruled. And in Brazil, of course, if you had one drop white, you were considered white. So which means that you had access to certain things that other people didn't. Or if you married a white person, you had certain affordances there, and things got complicated. And I wanted to speak about these complications from a historical perspective as it shows up in the performances of, or the lack thereof, in some instances, performances of Blackness through my sister's languaging. and which inevitably carries associations with social class as well, and locations. So rather than just explaining or trying to explicate the chapter, I wanted to basically describe what I did because I want to encourage everybody to read the book, and also to understand from this perspective. In our case, it was dealing with what we inherit as the myth of the racial democracy, which is basically states that there's one phase in Brazilian cultural production in the 1910s and 20s when whitening became, of course, a policy in, in covert ways, of course, with incentives for European migration, especially of Italian heritage, and later on Japanese after the Second World War. But this narrative of multiplicity of the Brazilian race being comprised of this amalgam and this mixture of different languages and different races. In the beginning, the Amerindian, the African, and the Portuguese, and later on, all these sort of migrations, and they all make their way to Portuguese to make Brazilian Portuguese particularly unique in its features and in its vast geographies as well. What the chapter discusses basically is I try to walk the reader through these complications in and out of historical discourses as well, and juxtaposing these events. The danger for me, of course, is always trying to make it too autobiographical or basically lose track of myself there, bearing witness to the performances of language and the tensions that arise between my sister and I, when, of course, inevitably she discovers she's adopted, and there's all this drama, and life is dramatic by itself, and what language shifts in that discovery and what language doesn't. And the difficulties, of course, in navigating this terrain of autoethnography as a genre, which is extremely difficult to write, I feel. Not so much because of the self-disclosure, because that's always sort of tricky, how much you reveal to conceal and how much you conceal to reveal. We're always doing that. But as a genre, it always pulls you to the self, and you kind of have to say there is no self here, of course, from a post-structuralist perspective, but that which is being built in discourse, which is what the perspective, of course, this chapter is. And my way out of it was basically sort of embrace the psychoanalytical process suggested by the editors, and try through this sort of grattage methodology, very psychoanalytically, juxtaposing these various discourses, not sure where things are going in the beginning, and then sort of like seeing the images forming, just like a painter would, start to basically put this convolution mass of colors and shapes, and then all of a sudden you start seeing something there as a method of discovery. So grattage was basically my autoethnographic sort of response or engagement with it. And I mean, I'm not neat. I don't think the life has conclusions, so the chapter doesn't arrive at, and in the end, we're all happy, or in the end, I discovered this. But I hope that the reader will get out what I understand a little bit better about the push and pull forces that operate in discourse in more than text level ways, in affective ways as well, in other kinds of atmospheres that still tend to pull us in Brazil to questions of erasing the existence of racial tensions that are carried through language. And this is something, of course, that scholars in Brazil have been examining forever, and in different sort of areas of inquiry, particularly social linguistics in Brazil has made interesting strides in terms of identifying sort of linguistic discrimination and basically touching on racializing aspects of the language that are there. So I tried to modestly contribute to that and find my path through these comings and goings and of these discourses, and even things that happen beyond that level, right? And to basically offer an idea of racial linguistics that is very complicated and very messy, and it's not so much centered on the self, but the discourses that the self is called upon to identify, sometimes as a subject, sometimes as an object. So here my Fukushian verb comes into play, right? It's not so much about being this put together, I know what I'm saying, rationalized human being, but that sort of working through these forces, historical forces that basically demand certain questions or positions from us, and then in turn we challenge them or we acquiesce strategically. So the chapter walks through this complexity to sort of like, okay, so we need to be talking about this, and so here are some ways that we can sort of open avenues for further research, perhaps in a more than representational avenue. Voila, and I hope I fulfilled my time limit. And thank you so much for your time. And here, of course, the image, I don't like to explicate things very much, but it's quite, I mean, you know, you can see this sort of vigilance and observation and sort of casting who's observing who is positioning who, and what kinds of myths we have to deal in terms of identification and how people identify themselves and the different positionalities they take, you know, beyond the centralized way. So thank you so much. Pleasure being with you.
Woo. Thank you, Sandro, and thank you to all of our authors who, in very individual ways, have all brought your chapters to life in ways that go beyond the page, but also, as Sandro says, connect us back to what is in those pages. So we now have close to 20 minutes for anyone who has either questions for the authors who have presented or the editors, or commentary and experiences to share. The floor is open. You can raise your hand or put a question in the chat. If you prefer to write in a language other than English, we may have someone who can read and translate.
And I will pause the recording from now, so it will be just a conversation for folks in the room.